So, what are we here to talk about today? We are here to talk about a big topic, which is when a great relationship doesn't equal great sex, also known as unblocking desire and unlocking the dance of bad sex in relationship. So today's training will be about an hour and a half long. We've got you for about an hour of that, Terry. So our plan will be that we'll have some content and some Q&A for about 60 minutes of our training. And then there'll be a little bit of content still after you sign off. So when Terry's answering questions, that won't be the end of the webinar. There's still some to go after that. So then we'll have a little bit more teaching, talk a little bit about the upcoming course that we're going to be offering, and some more Q&A. During this whole thing, our chat will be off as we just turned it off. So please post your questions in the Q&A. And then the next slide, please. So when you post your questions in Q&A, there will be times that I will be doing my best to keep an eye on those, not while I'm talking, because I've learned I can't do both things, which is talk and read at the same time, surprisingly. We will also have Griselda watching the Q&A, and she'll give me she'll highlight some questions that she thinks might be interesting. But I will also take a look as often as I can. I might summarize your questions and answer them, or ask them back to Terry. But either way, if we have you come on to ask your question live, please, what we'll do is have Griselda send you the join as a panelist link. And when you do that, please accept it. Turn your camera on, because only those on camera can ask questions live, and be ready to unmute yourself. So that's how we'll handle Q&A. Okay, so, the funny thing about this is that when I was preparing for this webinar, when I was preparing for this course overall and this webinar specifically, there was this moment when I thought, how in the heck did I get here? How in the heck did it end up being that I'm going to talk about RLT and sex? How does it happen that I got interested in sex and relationships in the first place? So I want to just kind of go backwards in time. First off, I'm trained as a systems therapist. So I have been curious about how external and internal systems inform our individual experience. That's why I trained as a systems person. That's of great interest to me. And how that works when it comes to sex is a big question. How does the external and the internal experience inform what we believe about sex? What our first consciousness, what our first thought is about sex, desire, and pleasure. But prior to going back to school to become a therapist, because I didn't do that until I was in my 30s, my background was actually studying cultural studies and comparative literature and feminist studies, which suited my role, frankly, going back even further, that came out of my family of origin as a lost scapegoat kid. So one of the gifts of a lost scapegoat kid is that I could see that there was something going on in my family system, and I felt kind of to blame for it, but I also knew that that wasn't quite true. So my role was to question everything, to wonder what the heck is going on here about everything. And that includes sex, desire, and relationships. But even further back than that, I'm a human. And as a human, as one of my very early supervisors and mentors said, we are sexual beings from the cradle to the grave. It's part of our humanity. It's part of our humanity. So as I was questioning everything, curious about everything, just trying to figure out what the heck is going on here in my life, part of my curiosity was around sex and relationships. So going forward in time, I go to grad school, and when I came out of grad school, initially I worked in community mental health, doing in-home with families. And in that setting, I started to get really curious about how do people relate to sex and pleasure and intimacy when they're struggling to even get their basic needs met.
Hmm.
That was a question I was curious about. And out of in-home therapy, I started working in eating disorder treatment. And when I was working in eating disorder treatment, my curiosity grew to become really curious about what happens to pleasure and desire when we are restricting or binging food and relating to our bodies in disordered ways, right? What happens in with ourselves and within our intimate relationships around sex and desire? And then I moved into private practice, where I really was primarily focused on couples and relationships. And at that point, I started to question, right? This questioning gift of the lost scapegoat about what was going on with these couples I was seeing, because what I had learned, and I went to a great program that I think prepared me really, really well to be a systems therapist and to be a relational practitioner. But what I was hearing about sex and relationships didn't match what I was seeing in my office. It was kind of like my experience growing up. What I heard was the truth, didn't match what I was experiencing was the truth.
Hmm.
So I was like, what's going on? And I got really curious. So the first time I heard anyone talk, for example, one of the things that didn't match was the way that people talked about gender and desire. I had been hearing all through my training that, when you are working with a male identified person, if they have low desire, there's either a medical problem that they need to address, like a hormonal issue, or there's something wrong with their wife in a heterosexual relationship. There's something wrong with that person, or they've got an issue with porn, or they're having an affair. But it was never really about this guy might just have low desire. The first person I ever heard address this in a non-pathologizing, not because of a hormonal issue, not because there's something wrong with his wife, way was you, Terry.
Oh.
In 2010, you did a segment for Good Morning America. Went back and
Hmm.
watched it, actually, because I was like, this is my memory. Is this true? And it is true. You did a segment with Good Morning America, and the issue was the guy had low desire. And you didn't ask him what his labs were and has he seen a doctor. And you didn't say, well, what's she doing that you're not attracted to her? You were like, what's your problem, dude? I mean, that's not what you said. That's what I would say. Um, and that was so refreshing for me, because that gave me some permission to actually be like, no, it's true. I am seeing something in my office that doesn't match what I'm hearing about when I go to trainings.
Hmm.
That was really powerful. That was in 2010. I started training with you in 2012. And as I dug in to sex and relationships, and it I continued to grow in sort of my understanding that the way that we've thought about it, the way that we've thought about desire, pleasure, sex, doesn't actually match the
Hmm.
way that it's talked about in relationship therapy and in sex therapy even. So that was the point at which I really started to question something that I had been taught. So, Griselda, will you put the slides up for a moment? That's slide number 5. Here was one of the things that I had been taught. Most of us are taught that good relationships and good sex are inextricably linked. And so if you have a couple and they come into your office and they say they're having a difficult sex life, what you really got to do is work on the relationship. Because once you fix the relational issues, the sex will just come along. There's another side to this. The vice versa is, in order to have good sex, you have to be having a good relationship, which meant that, like, as I had couples coming into my office and they were in relationship distress, and I would ask them about what their sex life is like. And they'd be like, yeah, no, it's fine. And I'd be like, you think so? Right? Like, I can admit that I had a little bit of a bias, that I wasn't quite sure that I believed them. I was like, well, how can you be having good sex when your relationship's such a mess? Some of these truisms just don't hold up. Priscilla, will you put the next slide up for a moment? The reality is that as therapists and coaches, we see all these constellations and descriptions of relationship and sex. So this one's pretty common, right? We're used to seeing it. There's relationship distress, and the couple talks about having a bad sex life. So that one we're kind of used to. But I've also seen it where they're talking about relationship distress and they're describing a good sex life. This one's the real confusing one, when a couple comes in and they talk about having actually a high degree of relationship satisfaction, but a bad sex life. We don't see this so much in our office, high relationship satisfaction and a good sex life, but that's kind of what we're looking for, right? That's the goal. Here's the thing, is that this is just an example of some of the constellations and matches that we might see. Well, there's kind of an infinite number of these, because the reality is you can when you have two or more people in a sexual relationship, they might not describe it in the same way, just like they might not describe their relationship satisfaction in the same way. But I want to go back to that relationship satisfaction, bad sex life combo, because this was a couple that I worked with that really invited me in to checking out some of my assumptions about what it means to have a good and a bad sex life. So you can take the slides down now, because I want to tell you about this couple that I worked with. And Terry, if you want to come on screen with me too, that's great.
Okay, great.
Well,
Bring
I'm
me on.
describing this.
Great.
So I worked with this couple, and they came in to see me. This was early on in my training as an RLT practitioner, maybe a couple years in, but I was already starting to take in a lot of what I was learning about being an RLT practitioner. But I didn't realize at the time just how many biases I had in place around what it means to have a good sex life or a bad sex life. So I was reading the pre-session material that I had gotten from them, both of their intake forms. And they both said pretty much the same thing. We've got a great relationship, but we've been fighting about sex, same fight, for 20 years. And I will tell you, I'm not embarrassed to admit I hold myself in warm regard for the assumption that I made that there was actually some relationship distress that I needed to get at. So I was like, we'll see. You say that the relationship's great, it's just about sex, but we'll see. Well, they came into my office, and turns out they were telling me the truth. They had a great relationship. They had done some relationship therapy at some point, and they had worked out some of the stuff that was rough between them. And they both said, we've got a great parenting relationship. We're totally on the same page. We have a wonderful relationship with each of our families. No in-law conflicts. We have wonderful work-life balance, satisfying careers, share in domestic tasks. And I was like, what?
I
What?
can see why you wouldn't believe them hearing that.
I was like, what? Uh, and they were like, no, the issue is this. We have a bad sex life. He was like, she doesn't desire me in the way that I want. And she was like, well, I don't mind sex, but I could kind of take it or leave it. And so I was like, okay, here we go. I know what's going on here. You don't have sex enough. And they were like, no, the frequency is not the issue. I was like, it's what? And they were like, yeah, we have sex 2, 3 times a week. I was like, you've been married for 20 years, you're having sex 2, 3 times a week? And you're like, we've got a bad sex life? What? I was like, so not everybody's having orgasms? They're like, no, we are. Once we get going, totally great. Fine. So I was like, what in the world do you mean by a bad sex life? So I'm going to pause the story here for a minute. I'm going to come back to it. And Griselda, will you bring up the slides about assumptions? So as I was thinking about this case that I worked with, I kind of went back in time and thought, what were some of my assumptions that I had about what it meant when somebody said they have a good or a bad sex life? Here are some of the assumptions that I realized. This list could go on and on. These are just a couple of assumptions that I think are really out there about what it means to have good sex or a good sex life. One is that spontaneous desire is somehow involved. Like if you are having a good sex life, somebody is like feeling amorous. They want sex, not because they've planned for it or scheduled it in because it's an important part of their relationship, just because they spontaneously want it. Like somehow that's involved. The penetrative sex is the goal. That one was less of a like conscious thought, because as a person that doesn't identify as straight, even though I live in a straight relationship, I sort of like, my conscious thought is that penetrative sex isn't always the goal. But I realized as I thought about this case that that was still sort of floating around in the background for me as a bias, that like there is a right kind of sex and it's penetrative sex. Another assumption about good sex is that you feel close to your partner or partners before, during, or after. Another assumption is that there's same level of desire is involved for all people. Another assumption is around frequency, that it's frequent. If it's frequent, it's good. And that everybody has to have an orgasm for it to be good sex. Those are just some that. So as you're listening to this, I'm going to invite you all to think about, just for a moment, what are some of the assumptions that you have when a couple says to you, either we have good sex or bad sex? What are some of the things that you automatically just jump to? Because we all have this. It's not bad. It's just what our brains do. The next slide is about some of the assumptions I realized I had about what it meant when somebody said they have bad sex or a bad sex life. These are assumptions. One assumption is that you have to work really hard at it. Man, I wish it was like the movies, in that like if you like a person, you just feel ready for it all the time. You're just like, yes, I'm in. That would be lovely. And so, one of the assumptions we sometimes have about a bad sex or bad sex life is that you have to work at it. You have to schedule it. You have to do these things. There's also some assumptions that there are good and bad types of sex, better or worse types of sex. This is one of my faves. Sex should never be only about pleasure. It should be about connection. That's one that I, think comes along with my socialization as a woman. That it's not okay to just want sex because I want sex. Yeah, I have to want sex because it means closeness. Another one is that the kind of sex we're having is outside the norm of gender expectations, whatever our identified gender might be, gender identity. Also, if it's infrequent, we have this word that we talk about, sexless marriages. And it turns out that like you could be having sex still and be in a sexless marriage, right? We've tied frequency, number of times you have sex in a year. And if you haven't passed a threshold, then you're in a sexless marriage. Talk about pathologizing and like labeling something as bad sex life based on numbers versus experience. Or that not everyone has an orgasm. That's another assumption that I realized just was floating out there. And again, I'm just going to invite you all to think about the like infinite number of just assumptions we jump to when somebody says we have a bad sex life. So I'll have you take down the slides again now, and I'll pick up on the story of this couple and how I actually worked with them. So I realized I really needed to dig in to what did they mean about having bad sex, that they have bad sex life, because it didn't match any of the assumptions I had. Luckily, RLT has taught me great data gathering skills. It taught me to turn that natural curiosity I had into actual questions and to ask them, well, okay, so if it's not those things, what do you mean when you say you have a bad sex life? And what he described is that she didn't desire him in the way he wanted to be desired. Yes, they had sex, but no, he didn't feel wanted by her. And she described this sort of I could take it or leave it relationship to sex, and that was what made it bad for her, was that like she could take it or leave it, but she had sex with him enough that she was like, why does he continually tell me that I need to desire him more? So let me say how I would have worked with this before RLT, what I think traditional sex therapy and traditional relationship therapy sets us up for, which is I would have worked with him on backing off of his expectation that of like frequency. I would have said like maybe stop pressuring her to have sex so often. Let's take a little break from sex and really see if you can develop some closeness and intimacy in your relationship that doesn't involve sex. And I would have worked with her on not having obligatory sex, and you don't have to do that if you don't want to do it. And I'll say this about that wouldn't have been bad. That would have been perfectly reasonable, good work. That would have been perfectly reasonable. That's a perfectly reasonable way to approach it. But here's what is different in RLT, is that we talk about in phase 1 that we do data gathering to understand the dance. What was the dance of bad sex for this couple? It wasn't about frequency. It was about what their first consciousness beliefs were. When we say first consciousness in RLT, for those of you who maybe don't know those terms, first consciousness means it's our knee-jerk response. It's our first thing that occurs to us when we think about any number of things, and specifically in this case, sex. And so I had the opportunity to really dig into what are their knee-jerk responses? What are their first consciousness responses about sex, and address those first consciousness beliefs instead of just changing behaviorally how they did or didn't negotiate sex. We did that eventually. But what's so different is that I taught them to do that from the wise adult part of them as it relates specifically to sex. So I worked with the guy on waking up to the grandiosity of his expectation, that there is a right way to be desired. And if she wasn't doing it that way, she was doing it wrong. That's what he was saying. I mean, she was like, yeah, I want to have sex with them, it's fine. But the more that he was like, you're doing it wrong, the more she was like, well, screw it then. Right?
Can I ask you a question, Anna?
Yeah.
I'm sure you did. If I were to say to this guy, what is it about the way she desires you that doesn't feel right to you, and what
Yeah.
would her desiring you in the right way look like? Really drill down to the specific. But what would he say? Do you know?
That there would be, yes, absolutely, because I did ask, that's what we got to, was that there was a way in which she would be expressing love that would make him feel like he's enough. Like that her desire would leave him feeling like he's enough. And so we had to work on that first consciousness that that should come primarily from her. And start with you got to be in touch with your own relationship with desire, pleasure, and intimacy, and say that that's right for you. And the way that she goes about it is not wrong.
Hmm.
And we worked on that, and that he could still request sex from her, like that he could still say, I want to be desired by you, and that they can work on that. But if he's in that one up position of there's a right way to be desired and you're doing it wrong, what was the likelihood that she was going to come forward with that? Like none, right? So, and to be honest, early in their relationship, it turns out that she had tried so many times.
Hmm.
But because this is a first consciousness belief, this isn't his wise adult, this isn't his grounded self, this isn't his second consciousness belief that's asking for it, right? That part, just that first consciousness of him just wants what it wants. And when it's not feeling that, it blames her. And so what RLT, what I've learned from you, Terry, is to take that kind of grandiosity on
Hmm.
and address it directly. And say, you get to want, but you don't get to demand and say it's wrong. Because not because you don't get to, but because if you do, you're not actually going to get what you want. So you got to come into relationship with that part of you that wants what it wants, when it wants it, how it wants it, in the way I say, and limit that in that way that we teach in RLT about loving limits for that first consciousness of us. There was another factor to this, which was, it turns out that early on in their relationship, so this is a couple that was, this is, quite a few years ago now. And this is a couple that was probably 10 years older than me at the time. So, slightly older Gen Xers, if on the edge boomers. And early on in their relationship, there had been a time when she had been feeling amorous towards him. They had started, they went right towards the beginning of their dating relationship. And she had had more sexual experience than he had. And so she kind of tried to like make some moves, and he was like, shamed her and shut her down, and was like, because he was intimidated by her experience. Because when I dug, here's what happened is in that phase 2 way, as I was working on developing mindfulness specifically around sex, and this is what I want to point out, is that it wasn't just like they had already done work on their relationship. It wasn't a general issue. It was specific to sex, desire, and pleasure. It was specific to that. And so when I dug into that with her, like, so has your relationship with desire always been ambivalent? And she says, no, it wasn't. But early on in the relationship, when I expressed to him, she said, I have this clear memory. We're in his dorm room, and I am trying to come on to him, and he's like, don't pressure me just because you've had a lot of sexual experience. Da 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 da. Well, for women who have been socialized to ignore desire in the first place, to ignore our cues for desire in the first place, that's unique to the socialization of girls and women. We are socialized to ignore that. And we don't have the obvious external physical cues that boys have. So it becomes really easy to ignore our cues for desire, our cues for interest. It's really easy to ignore that. Well, if you have a partner who also tells you that you're bad and wrong for having them, yeah, you really learn to shut off to that.
Hmm.
So her interest in sex, she learned to be just respondent. Anybody familiar with the term respondent sexual desire? Yeah, this is actually not such a helpful term always. It was meant to help depathologize the difference in desire, but it ends up still putting the responsibility for female desire on their male partner. Male partners experience spontaneous desire, females experience respondent desire. Well, so then whose responsibility is it to tune into desire? You still have to be given permission by your male partner if you're in a heterosexual relationship. But because of this socialization, even in same gender, same sex relationships, this becomes really tricky because who then gets to initiate if you're in a same female gendered relationship? Female. Becomes really tricky. So as we continued to work through phase 1, the data gathering, waking up, connecting with changing the dance, phase 2, working on developing that cultivated second consciousness around sex, desire, pleasure, intimacy. There was another part, which was repair. And that's a thing that we see differently in RLT than other models. Again, we don't think of it as repair as just an apology. It's about coming into connection from the wise adult part of ourselves with another wise adult person. Second consciousness to second consciousness. I take accountability for the impact that I had. And I'm not going to do that anymore. So that's what we did. And that's what RLT as a model gave me the framework to learn how to do. That's what it taught me, was to turn that natural curiosity and to question the assumptions, to question some of the beliefs that I had had. Not that they were wrong entirely, just that it's not always how it works. There's a much wider variety of that out in the world. And without RLT, if I had gone with that more traditional way of treating their sex life, I think that it would have worked, frankly. It would have worked. But would the dance have changed between them? Not really. We would have changed the way that they behaved around sex, but the actual dance of what do I do when I want to feel desired? How do I go about that? How do I work from my second consciousness to negotiate that with my partner? And when I do or don't want sex, and to even tune into it on the other side, to be able to take initiative that's right for me or not, but to have decision, to have choice. That's what second consciousness gives us. Choice. We can decide. So to unblock the desire, we have to tune into that second consciousness, cultivate the second consciousness. And to change the dance, we can't just change the behavior. We have to change the relationship that we have within ourselves, first and foremost, to our own beliefs about sex and sexuality and desire and pleasure. So, yeah,
I have some thoughts about your
yeah,
case. May
yeah,
I?
absolutely. Please.
Okay, sure. Okay. So a couple of things as I'm listening. One, so much of working, particularly with heterosexual women, but all women, uh, is helping them move into their own right to be erotic and have sexual pleasure
Absolutely.
and assert that, and precisely to not be responsive repositories for male desire, but to own their own, which is the work you did with this woman. One thing that glaringly comes out as I listen to the story is the same man who was um, feeling one down and inadequate in the face of his wife's superior sexual experience and shamed her for her sexual desire was the same man who was complaining that she didn't have enough sexual
Yeah,
desire for him.
exactly.
And I want to talk about how changing the relational dynamic doesn't always shift the sexual dynamic. But I also want to say that sometimes it does. In this case, as I listen to this, maybe not outside the bedroom, but vis-a-vis sex, I would say using the RLT grid,
Yes.
this guy was a one-up, i.e. grandiose, entitled love addict,
Mm-hmm.
in that in order for me to feel good, I have to feel like you desire me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not, if I were one down, I would beg you to desire me. That's
Mm-hmm.
more a woman's game. If I'm one up, I would demand that you desire me.
That's right.
And this guy is so typical of so many of us in that he was perfectly happy to complain about what he wasn't getting,
Right.
having the vulnerability of encouraging her to actually give him what he wants is a whole different ballgame.
That's exactly right. That's
And
exactly right.
how many of us can it's so much easier for us to complain about what we're not getting than it is to ask for and encourage our partners to give us more.
Yeah,
That's straight RLT.
it
So
is. Yeah,
case in point here.
that's right. So here's what's interesting is part of why I'm bringing this case in is because that you're absolutely right. Their grid placements around sex were specific to their relationship around sex. It was
Hmm.
not the same as their grid placements outside of the bedroom.
Yeah.
Outside of the bedroom, she was one up, walled off. He was one down, boundaryless. In the bedroom, she's one down, walled off. He's one up, boundaryless. So they changed positions, and that's where the like very often, what's happening in the bedroom is also happening outside of the bedroom. But the part that I'm kind of making a case for is that we have to assess for what's happening in the bedroom in a really specific kind of way, because maybe it matches their grid placements outside of the bedroom, and maybe it doesn't. And
Which
so,
also means
yeah,
that if you fix the dynamic outside of the bedroom, where couple therapists have been taught, well, that'll fix the sex. Guess what?
exactly. Doesn't
Maybe
work.
yes, maybe no.
Yeah. And for this couple, it didn't, right? That's exactly what we were running up against. So when they were like, yeah, we've really learned a lot about how to be good partners to each other in the 20 years we've been married, it was like, yeah, they have. Even though they have those grid placements, they had worked on, and they hadn't worked with an RLT therapist, but they had worked on, doing things differently. And it was, they mostly resisted that outside of the bedroom. But in the bedroom, it was unique. And that's where I think we have to really ask these big, difficult questions like, what does it mean when a couple says, for example, that they've got a sexless marriage? Like, what's our automatic? What's our own practitioner? As like I like to say, our practitioner AC is often not as egregious as our like in real life AC, but we've got one. Like we have to check out what our first consciousness thoughts are around how we work with our couples. And so like what does it mean? What do we jump to an assumption, or do we dig into it when they say we've got a sexless marriage? I've worked with people who say we've got a sexless marriage, and I'm like, well, what do you mean when we're talking about frequency? Because that's like sexless. Well, I mean, it's been like a couple of weeks.
I have a fun, I can't get through a whole hour being completely straight, so to speak. So here's a story, true story. So I'm pretty young couples therapist, but I'm already teaching. I'm up at Smith in a social work program where I graduated, and I'm teaching couples therapy. And I'm on a break, and I call Belinda, who's most people know is also a terrific family and couples therapist. I said, "How was your day?" She said, "Oh my God, I just had the most amazing." What? A young couple came to me, and they said they were coming in to fix their sex life, which was a disaster. I said, "What made it a disaster?" Frequency. I said, "What's your frequency?" They said, "Our frequency has dropped to 4 times a week." And then Belinda kind of looked at me and said, "I think you and I need to talk." So I thought that was hilarious. I go into this room full of like 20-year-olds, social work, and I tell them this amusing, I'm like 40. I tell them this amusing story about my marriage that Belinda, my wife, hears they've dropped to 4 times a week. And then my wife says to me, "I think you and I need to talk." Not one of the 20-year-olds laughed. They all just
Yes.
looked at me like, "Oh, you poor guy.
Yeah, only
You're not
four.
doing it 4 times a week?" Anyway,
Oh, yeah,
so many assumptions. You know what? Here's my t-shirt. Stop striving for the sex you think you're supposed to be having and start enjoying the sex you're having.
that's right.
That's that's my
Right.
t-shirt for the day.
Well, and we can only do that from our wise adult part, right? It's only our cultivated second consciousness, specifically around sex and pleasure and desire, that can stop complaining and enjoy.
Yeah. And if I may, can I say a few general things?
Please, because that's what I would love is you've been such a pioneer around asking hard questions. And it's hard to ask about sex. It's really hard to bring that in. And one of the things that I just want to name is that it's hard to bring it in. And so I'd love some of your tips and tricks about how to do that. Um, and some of the things that you do assess for when you're assessing. It's the other part of it is that particularly for people who are in marginalized positions in their relational or sexual lives. So LGBTQIA folks, people in poly or ethical non-monogamy, and they come in, and if we aren't explicit about inviting them to talk about sex, we are implying that the kind of sex that they're having is wrong. Now, that might not be what we think. It might not be what we believe, but if we let our own fears about asking get in the way, that's the unintended outcome, is that for folks who have been in historically marginalized positions, in who they love, have sex with, and desire, if we're not talking about, if we as the practitioners, therapists, and coaches aren't asking, they're getting the message that it's bad and wrong and they shouldn't talk about it. So I think it's so important. And you've been such a, like, you've been such a pioneer, and you taught me how to ask the hard questions. What are some of the ways you bring it up?
Um, Here's the RLT rule. When in doubt, ask.
Yeah.
And that includes asking about asking. So if you're nervous about, ooh, is this couple going to feel imposed upon
Yeah.
if I ask about sex? Are they going to feel intruded upon? Is this the right moment? Guess what you can do? Um, so Anna plus partner and Anna plus one. Um, I'm curious about your sex life. Do you mind if I ask about it?
Beautiful.
Duh, duh.
Yeah.
You're off the hook.
Beautiful.
And that's called contracting, which is big in RLT. Contracts are there to protect you. So if you say to somebody, "I'm thinking about your sex life, and I'd like to ask about it. Is that okay with you?" And they say yes, then it's harder for them to turn around and act like you victimized them. They agreed to it. People will still do it, but it's harder. if you're worried or you're uncomfortable about are they going to be okay if I ask about sex? Just ask them. Can I ask you about sex? Is this an okay time to do that? And you may get different answers from the two different partners, and that's grist for the mill, and you get to deal with that. So we're relational in our role as therapists. We don't know. We have humility. We don't know. You put something out, and then you see what you get, and you
Mhm.
respond to what's in front of you. We don't have to know this in advance, but we can ask. Can I ask you about sex? Uh, can I ask you what is it like for a heterosexual therapist to be asking you about your gay sex life? How is that for you?
Mhm.
Um, and then you just follow what they do. So, sex and money are taboo generally. In a cocktail conversation, you don't ask people about their sex lives. You don't ask people about their finances. So we do have a sort of cultural inhibition around, oh, I don't want to impose on them. I don't want to be. Remember, the pass rule is the first thing we say in RLT. You have the right to pass.
Yeah.
You can't stop your partner from speaking, but you don't have to. Is that okay? That's the first contract we offer, the pass rule and confidentiality. You have the right to pass, so I'm not imposing. And beside that, I just asked you, is it okay? And you said it's okay. You know
Mhm.
what? If you have those two things in place, oh, therapist, breathe. You're
Yeah.
fine. It's collaborative. Don't worry about it. Go for it. So that's one. And then it is interesting that um, the idea that fixing their emotional intimacy will fix their sexual intimacy, maybe yes, maybe no. Some people have shitty relationships but a great sex life, and that's a resource. That's
Yeah.
positive. Some people have a shitty relationship and a great sex life, and that's actually indicative of how walled off and how intimate they are. And you look
Right.
at them and you go, whether you choose to say it or not in your heart, you're going, you shouldn't be having such a great, you guys hate each other. That's pretty dissociative of you two to be having a
Right.
great sex. And which of the two is it? Are, these are subtle questions. Experience will teach you, your gut will teach you. If need be, get some supervision or peer supervision. The other thing I want to say to people is have humility.
Mhm.
Anna, you're a trained sex therapist. I'm not. I'm a
Mhm.
generalist. Belinda's a trained sex therapist. I'm not. And if I'm dealing with you and your partner and we're talking about sex, I have, I don't know, a few cards in my back pocket over the years. Uh, it, if I work on the relationship and the sex follows, great. If I work on the relationship and the sex doesn't follow, and we just start talking about the sex, and maybe I've got an intervention, schedule sex, don't wait for
Mhm.
it to be spontaneous. And that works great. If after my fourth or fifth card gets played, the relationship's better, we've talked sex to death. I've tried a few of the things I know, it doesn't work. Guess what? It's time to refer the couple to a trained sex therapist, which
Yeah.
I'm not.
Right.
And I say that to people up front. Uh, I'm a generalist. I'm like a GP. Let's deal with it. We'll see how far we get. If we get, great. If not, let's get you at least a consultation with a specialist. So don't
Yeah.
be shy about you asking for help, supervision, consultation. Don't be shy about referring them to a sex therapist, but also don't be shy about seeing what you can do before you refer them to a specialist.
I'm so glad you said that. Can we like spend a second on that? Because that's that's what I'm hoping we'll do as part of the course is dig into for people who want to get trained around this, further trained around this. Where is that line about it being outside of my competence? And where is it that I'm getting hung up on my own biases or beliefs and I'm
Right.
stuck? And so I think that that is that's a fine line, just like with the couple that you were talking about, where they've got a bad, they're having a lot of relationship distress, but they also are having a good sex life and being able to use that as a resource versus like, uh, it's like, no, you're using it as sort of like dissociation and avoidance. How do we know? Well, we gotta stick with it for a minute and be curious in ourselves and with them. Do you have other thoughts about that? Because I
Yeah.
just think it's so important.
And it really comes through in your case. Well, we have 8 million sayings in our tongue, and here's one of them. Generic, weak, specific, strong.
Yeah.
And most therapists hang out at the surface, intellectual, talk, 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 and they don't go down. And you went down, RLT therapists go down.
Yeah.
So my wife doesn't desire me in the way that I would wish her to. Okay, well, let's work on that. No, what in the world are you talking about? Like, what does that mean exactly? What does not desiring her in the way you would wish her to actually look like to you? What would her desiring you in the way you would wish her to look like to you?
Yes.
How have you responded to your discomfort? What have you actually done, said, if anything? Well, mostly I complain. And how does she respond to your? So we're in and out of going deeper into the subjective experience of the individual. We go much deeper in individual work than most couples therapists. But then we
Mhm.
also go out feeling that way. What do you do? And then when you do that, significant other, how do you feel when they do that? And
Mhm.
then what do you do? So it goes deep into the individual and then back to the system, from the system back into the individual, and then back. It's sort of in and out and in and out and deeper and more and more specificity.
That's
Uh,
right. Yeah.
so, for example, when you drill down with the woman, you don't desire him in the way that he wants you to. Well, actually, I did. And he
Right.
shut me down. Boom.
Right.
That opened up your case. But it was your capacity to go deep with them and be specific and not tell yourself that you knew what the hell they were talking about before you actually did that opened this whole thing up. So not only inquiry, but deep inquiry.
That's right.
What do you mean by that? What would that look like? And what
Yeah.
did you do with feeling like that? And what did she do when you did that? And just hold
Staying with it.
steady. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll say this, it took several sessions to get to that story, you know, partially because I'm not, again, not ashamed to admit, this is how I had been taught, was that I was like, oh, sure, she's ambivalent sexually, like so many women. This is a cultural, I actually don't think that this is true. I think it's how we're socialized to pay attention to desire. And that's a big thing that I want to be able to talk about in the course and dig into more, is where do all of those beliefs about women being more inhibited sexually come from? Because there's a lot of that that's a result of being socialized to not pay attention, not because it's not there. And it really comes out of primarily like Western culture about ignoring your sexual desire. Not all cultures have that, but this predominant one that I grew up in and live in certainly does.
Yeah, I agree. And then the corollary for many straight, sort of majority men is an entitlement to sex not always. There are also many men who avoid sex. That's another stereotype.
That's
But
right.
an entitlement to sex, and then in some ways putting all of their emotional eggs in that one basket. It's like,
Right.
I'm not. We don't talk. I don't need to talk to you. I don't need to share my heart with you, but I need a blowjob once a week. Really? And then
Hmm.
I'll be fascinated to hear what you say in the court. I've been struck with, so many of these men get so like hurt
Yeah.
when their wives say, like, honey, she just got a stomach ache. Why are you in the corner weeping? But they get into this. This is like male abandonment or something. But these men, they hear no sexually, and they're like crushed.
Yeah.
I want you. I want to hear what you have to say about it. Anyway, there's a lot to
Yeah.
think about, but uh,
Yeah.
it's exciting to listen to you speak about bringing RLT to this topic. Well, listen, I gotta go.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for
It's
joining me.
thrilling to watch you do this, and enjoy her, everybody, and see you in the class.
Great. Yes. And thank you so much for joining us, Terry. I've got a little bit more content. So just because Terry's leaving, it doesn't mean it's the end of our webinar. But thank you, Terry. And really, truly, for me, thank you also for this framework that gave me a way to ask those questions I had always been dying to ask.
You know what? It's thrilling to watch you rock out with it and elaborate it. So blessings. Bye,
Take
everybody.
care. See ya. All right. So again, this is still going. I know that that might be a little confusing for some, thinking that's over, but we do have a little bit more and then some Q&A. And I want to just pick up on a few of the pieces that are left from talking about assessing. Chrisella, will you bring up the slide about some of the things we have to assess for outright? Great, thank you. So what I don't want to ignore is that these are also really important issues. So as you know, this goes along with what Terry and I were just talking about the need to really drill down, because what was relieving for me about the first time that I heard Terry talk about uh, male low desire, not related to a medical issue or something wrong with his wife. That was really relieving because that wasn't so much in the discussion at the time. It is much more now. It's much more normal to talk about that now. And I am so relieved. It's one of the ways that I have seen relationship work move forward around sex and sexuality in the last really about 10 years, which is it's far less taboo to talk about male low desire than it used to be. It's always been on the table to talk about female low desire. That was like normal. But male low desire, that's taken some time to come along, and it's much, much easier to talk about these days. And it's much more in our discourse as practitioners. But there are some things that we do need to assess for outright. And so trauma, and uh, Terry mentioned his brilliant wife, Belinda Berman Reel, is a expert in this area around sex therapy and trauma. And she's actually going to be joining for one of the classes to talk about how to assess for when the trauma can be dealt with within this relational framework and when it actually does need a referral, because that's important. We also want to look at medical issues that might be happening. Sexual pain, that's real. And there's some, the world of physical therapy for sexual pain has just gone gangbusters in the last couple of years. So we want to assess for that and then make appropriate referrals. We want to also pay attention to age. Now, in paying attention to age, it's important that we don't go like that. We also check out what our biases are, and to notice, are we going into a bias about how age and sexuality and desire work together? There are some things that there are reasons we have biases, because there are some things that are real and are present, and we want to check out if it's true for this particular client, for this particular couple, for this particular relational, poly, ethical, non-monogamy group that's in front of us, because it might be, it might not be. Hormone levels and co-occurring disorders. So you can take the slides down again now. I want to give us a chance to ask some questions in just a minute, but before we get there, I want to invite all of you to take just a minute and notice, as I was talking about the case that I worked with, some of the biases that can be there, as Terry and I were discussing the difficulty with bringing it up when we're working with couples and individuals, with groups, across identities. It's like hard to bring up. Did you find yourself thinking about your clients? Or did you find yourself thinking about your own relationship with desire, sex, sexuality, pleasure? If we're honest, many of us do think about that. And in RLT, as fellow travelers, that's a core concept of being an RLT practitioner, is that we think of ourselves as, just as likely as anyone else to be facing these questions. That certainly contributed to, in amongst all of those other factors that I mentioned about why I was interested in sex and sexuality and intimacy and pleasure and desire, my own stuff certainly came into it, right? Like, that's what we have to pay attention to as fellow travelers. And so just invite you to notice, well, what kind of questions are coming up for you, even about you. And not that you need to ask them in this webinar, large format, but I just want to give an invitation that that's what we're going to be talking about as part of the course as well, because it is really important for us to pay attention to our own relationship with where are we at in our cultivation of a sexual second consciousness. I just took a quick scan over some of the questions that were coming in the Q&A, and there was a lot that was kind of landing for me as though there's a bit of a binary split that can happen. Either it is or it isn't. It's this or it's that. What if a couple says that they're not interested in sex at all? That's an invitation to dig a little deeper and say, like, not at all, or is it certain types of sex that you're not interested in, right? Like, we've got to kind of like build that curiosity and figure out what it means when we go just beyond the sort of either or. That either or binary is driven by our first consciousness knee-jerk reaction to things. And when we're uncomfortable, we're more likely to go into that binary, which makes us less likely to ask the questions. So that's the other part that's going to be in the course, is the opportunity to dig into that even a little deeper. Griselda, I just want to talk about what's going to be included in the course. Could you put that slide up for a moment? So after this webinar concludes today, we are going to have an availability to sign up for a course, and it's going to be 8 sessions long over the course of 4 weeks, twice a week. So it's going to be live online, and it begins March 11th. Next slide, please. So what are we going to cover? In the first class, we're going to be really digging even further into the myth of the happy relationship and the impact on patriarchy and on sex and sex therapy. Because as we talked about a little bit today, that like the respondent desire part, that's coming out of the sex therapy world. And there's a fair amount of evidence that supports the idea of respondent desire for women and spontaneous desire for men, but how much of that is because that's how we've been socialized to pay attention to desire? How do I know if we're having spontaneous desire? For example, as women, we have fewer external cues. And so we're going to really be talking about, like, what are the influences that have contributed to how we've talked about sex and sex therapy through relationship therapy. Also, we're going to go in our next class, we're going to go deeper into RLT's approach to sex. Where have we been? Kind of what Terry was talking about. And then where are we still going? Where are we going next? As I mentioned in class 3, Belinda Berman-Reel is going to be joining to talk about trauma and sex, the impact of trauma on sexual connection. In class 4, Dr. Lori Davis, who is a certified sexologist, will be joining. I saw a question come in about is there a version of the relationship grid as it relates to desire? And the answer is yes, Lori has developed one. And so she'll be bringing that in as we also move beyond the binds of some of our heteronormative socialization. So whether we identify as hetero or not, is we all have been under the influence of the socialization that goes along with heteronormative sexual beliefs and relationship stereotypes. So we're going to talk about how that works and then look at the desire discrepancy grid that Lori has developed, which is brilliant and fantastic. I can't wait for that. Both of those super fabulous guests to come on. And then in our last class, we're going to be talking about developing a sexual second consciousness. And this is, again, what is sort of the differentiating factor of RLT from other models, is talking about that we've got some tools, some practical tools for addressing desire discrepancy, the sexless marriage, and lifelong pleasure. So in addition to those 5 classes, which will each be 90 minutes long, we also will have 3 live Q&A calls. So a total of 8 sessions. They'll be at noon Eastern on Tuesdays and Thursdays, starting on March 11th and concluding on April 2nd. And they will all be recorded, so you can watch later. For those of you who are less familiar with RLT terms, there is also, we're throwing in a bonus of an overview of RLT. So you'll be able to have access to that overview that gives you kind of some familiarity with some of the terms we're using. We didn't have as much time today to dig into some of those terms like first consciousness, second consciousness. You also heard me use the term wise adult. Wise adult is synonymous with second consciousness, synonymous with a cultivated, a developed awareness, not just our knee-jerk reaction. So it's a pretty robust class, and I'm really hopeful all of you who are interested might be able to join me. So now is the time that we'll dig into some Q&A. So if you've got questions, feel free to raise your hand, and then Griselda, you'll let me know if there's somebody, is that right? And then make them a panelist. At that point, you'll have to turn on your camera and come on. But so questions, thoughts?
Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to remind everybody, if you want to ask a question, you'll have to raise your digital hand. Just press that button at the bottom of your screen. It says raise hand. I will send you an invitation to become a panelist. You have to accept that invitation and be ready to unmute yourselves and turn on your cameras, please.
Yeah. All right. So there are a couple of things I wanted to touch on too. Just as I'm like scanning through some of the Q&As that people have submitted. One question came through asking if we teach towards monogamous or non-monogamous relationships. And in RLT, we take a pretty broad view in that we explicitly believe that that non-monogamy can be a valid form of having a relationship. If consent and negotiation is involved, then like we are inclusive of that, of ethical non-monogamy and polyamory as a valid way of having relationship. So we don't specifically teach towards or against any one thing. It's also perfectly valid to have a monogamous relationship. And that's part of what we have to check out as practitioners. As Terry said, he thinks of himself as a generalist. So if you notice in yourself, because the thing about biases is there are biases that we're like, oh, there's that bias. I'm not sure that that's one that I want to have stop me. I just want to be aware that it's there for me. And then some of our biases are really important information for us about who we're going to work with and who we're not. I have some biases that I know I don't get past. And so then those are clients that when they come to me, I'm going to refer out of respect for them. And so if you notice you have a bias around monogamy or non-monogamy, then you might want to, I'm not saying you need to get over that. It's more like just to pay attention to it. And if you have a bias around that, to be respectful of yourself and your clients, and refer them to somebody who works with ethical non-monogamy. So I'd like to invite the first person who raised their hand to come on screen and ask your question.
Okay, I'm gonna bring on Anna Chapman.
Okay, great.
Hey, Anna. Anna,
Hi.
I'm
Hi, Anna.
So my question was just as you're doing this research and as you're working with people, if there's specific groups that you're seeing struggling with this stuff more. So example, are you seeing couples that are coming out of patriarchal religious cultures, maybe a purity culture, struggling with this type of stuff, or is it really unrelated to that and you're seeing it across the board?
It's a really great question, and it's a both and, which is I have worked with for some reason for a period of time. I ended up with a lot of clients, particularly men who were coming out of purity culture upbringings, and I would say that there are unique challenges. The challenges are unique when you've come out of a purity culture, like
Right.
all kinds of really unique things, including around your roles related to gender, right? And then how that works with sex and sexuality. Yeah, it gets messy and complicated. And I would also say that part of this is pretty universal, right? Like the water we swim in is the water we swim in. And whether that's been in some of the more extreme versions or not, purity culture is informed by patriarchy in general. And we all experience patriarchy to some degree. So it's sort of a matter of degree. So there's some unique challenges within those groups. And then there are some pretty universal themes across the board. How does that land with you? Does that make sense?
That's good. I mean, do you tailor it differently when that flavor is added on to the top of it all?
Well, what I would say is that kind of like what Terry was talking about in the general, weak, specific, strong, that in many ways we tailor specifically for the clients that are in front of us kind of all of the time by going in and figuring out specifically what's going on here, not with, but keeping that sort of assumption about what is right and what is wrong out here, where we're aware that that might creep in at times. And also, you know, one of the things that I think is important is checking our own beliefs or biases around religion too, and the role of it, and just being curious with our clients about what the gifts are of it, Nothing is all bad, nothing is all good. Like, what were some of the things you actually got from that you want to retain? And what are the things you want to let go? And that comes around sexuality, that comes around relationships, that comes around worldview. Like, that it's not like you need to throw everything out. It's about navigating what are the things that serve me and what are the things that don't.
Yeah, really good. Thank you. I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
great question. Thanks, Anna. All right, another.
Okay, you ready for the next one, Hannah?
Please,
All right,
yes,
I'm gonna bring on Juliet.
fantastic. Hi, Juliet.
Hi. I have more of like a case example. I have a couple where it wasn't quite clear whether it was a sex or the relationship, but I think the female person in this relationship, a heterosexual relationship, is has done a lot of work, and sort of she's a quick changer and he's a slow changer,
Yeah.
and she's doing a lot of work and feeling like a lot of access to her desire, and
Mm-hmm.
has attempted using that as like a point to connect, but it's actually turned into like more resentment. Like, how can she feel that? And it's mixed messages, and
Yeah.
she wants this, but then all of these other things are wrong, and it's adding more confusion, but it's also like exciting that she has access for it. And,
Right.
as a heterosexual woman myself and part of the patriarchy, I'm like, I want to celebrate that for her and encourage that for her. And it's strange that in the relationship it's not benefiting them, it seems.
Yeah. Yeah. Juliet, this is not a good, bad, right, wrong question, but are you familiar with the RLT model generally?
A little bit, yes. Yeah, I'm in training for so yes, a little bit.
Beautiful. Awesome. Okay. And for those of you who aren't as familiar, I'm going to use some language here that is very RLT language, which is the idea of blatant and latent, right? And so I'm not saying that in all of their relationship, she would have been a latent, but when it comes to sexuality, having a shutdown, I don't pay attention to my sexuality. I don't pay attention to desire. Like, there's no point in bringing that up. That's a kind of a latent socialized position. This is why it's important to pay attention to how it works specifically around sexuality that might be different, and desire and pleasure that might be different than other parts of their life, right? But for her, she's kind of been in that one down. It sounds like one down, shut down, and now she's waking up to it. And in RLT, we talk about how when a latent starts to come up in a relationship, oftentimes they flip into the blatant position. And that can happen in this same way, where there can be some false empowerment around resentment, about speed, about how it should go, like in waking up to sexuality and desire. And so it's continuing to work with what I would make up about your couple, and of course there's lots of factors that we can't get into, but what does it look like to hold the both, and that grounded center, that cultivated of like, yes, I get to have, this is so exciting, and I do want to celebrate that I'm waking up to sexual desire, to pleasure, to being in my body, to feeling that. And how do I not go into judgment about how my partner is responding and the timing of it? Does that make sense? So working with that part that wants it to be faster, wants it to be this way, wants it to be that way, and not saying it's wrong for any of those things to be coming up, but if we just let those things kind of run rampant, it becomes no different than somebody who has been, let's say, a high desire male identified person and demanding frequency types, desire from our partner. How does that land with you?
I think it's hard. I think there's like maybe some assumptions. He wasn't a high frequency
No, yeah.
person, and she wasn't so latent because she had the access, but like through kids and things, it sort of
Yeah.
dormant for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like it's back. And I don't feel the pressure coming from her to him to like
Okay.
meet her. I feel him being, it's just like more negativity from him.
Got it. I misunderstood your
Like,
question.
how can you be feeling good and how could you want this from me? And how are you
Mhm.
upset with me here, but then you're happy with me there? And it's like, it's confusing
Yeah.
to him. So it's
Yes.
hard because it's technically a good thing and it's positive, but they're not sharing in that. And so it's leading them to
Yeah. Yep.
further disconnect. So I don't know. I don't want to take up everybody's time, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So thank you for clarifying. And I didn't mean that I thought he was a higher desire male. It's more like sometimes that flip, it's like the replication of what we have seen. And if that's not what she's doing, that it sounds like I misunderstood that that's not what the pressure isn't coming from her. It's more from him around how can you be moving into that. So,
Mhm.
what it is really that like digging in and assessing around like what is coming up for him
Mhm.
around her ability to be in desire now. What's
Mhm.
that like for him really? What's the meaning he makes of it? What's
Mhm.
the story he tells himself about what that means about him?
Mhm. Mhm.
And going into what that first consciousness response is in him,
Mhm.
while you still celebrate it, that second consciousness, this cultivation that she's able to enjoy. And working on what is the background for him, what's his history and story about what it's meant when he's not had the same level of desire. What does he believe about that?
Mhm.
What's the meaning he makes about who he is in the world and how he can show up as a male partner to her if
Mhm.
he doesn't have the same desire? That's one of the complications that starting to be able to talk about um, desire discrepancy with male identified folks on the lower end, that I think is so important and helpful, because for so many guys, and I've heard this over and over and over again from people in my office, they just did that. Like, it feels like they've lost some identity as a man, because so much of the message out there is that men want sex all the time. And so if you don't want sex as much as if you're in a heterosexual relationship as your female partner does, what does that mean about your identity just at its core? And so I've worked with guys around that, and being able to make a different meaning, come into a different kind of mindfulness around that, and then skillfully decide how much I do and don't want to engage in sex with my partner, and build my own relationship with desire without it being right or wrong, some expectation about how much desire you should have. That's the thing, like, clients come with their own set of assumptions about good sex, bad sex, desire, pleasure, frequency, blah, blah, blah. Does that land?
Yeah, super helpful. I like to say we have no definition of good sex. We have
That's
definition of
right.
bad sex. We have no definition of good sex. You guys have to decide it. Here we go.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
So,
exactly right.
thank you. Yeah.
So it's a both and, because it's both paying attention to what it is for each person in the relationship. What is that? And getting curious and open and staying warm to ourselves for whatever that answer is. And then bringing it back into the relationship, just like Terry was saying, like, it's within ourselves and then back into the relationship, and then back to ourselves and then back into the relationship. And that dance around that is sometimes a replication of what's happening in the rest of their lives. And sometimes it's very unique to sex, because sex, like I said, we are sexual beings from this cradle to the grave, meaning we've already been developing a relationship with ourselves around what it means to be a sexual being, whether anybody talked to us about it or not, from the time we are very young. It's a part of our humanity. And that relationship is between us and us. And then when we're in relationship and we want to be in an intimate relationship, Now we want to share that with another person. Well, that gets real crunchy. So that's the invitation, is to pay attention to the both and. How does it work within me? And then how does it work within an us?
Beautiful,
Thank you,
thank you.
Juliet. Yeah. We have maybe one more quick one. Anybody have a quick one?
Okay, yes, I'll bring on Roy.
Okay, great.
Hi, nice to be. I
Hi. Great to have you here, Roy.
think I'm unmuted. There we go. Great to be with you, Anna, and so looking forward to this. I'm so excited for this. I just wanted to say that I really liked the healthy sexual relationship, healthy relationship, unhealthy
Mhm.
relationship,
Yeah.
unhealthy sex. So I really liked that, and it made me reflect a little bit on what you call the external, what you call like the external evidence of desire for men. And I think there's also like the same thing could be said in a way for a soft penis with high desire,
Right.
right? And a hard penis with low desire.
That's right.
Right, because I think men. So I wanted to just sort of like as a penis owner,
Yeah.
I wanted to welcome in that also that sort of
Absolutely.
thoughtfulness around the fact that a soft penis does not mean no desire as an external
Cute.
evidence of anything.
Mhm.
Yeah, in fact, I think some of the strongest and most lovely experiences I've had as a male body, my penis hardness has had nothing to do with it. So
Absolutely.
I just
It's beautifully said.
wanted to drop that in there because I think it's another way that we can just open and think about all the ways that we think about what is an external male expression of desire, and that would be like the number one. Otherwise,
Yeah.
right.
Right.
What does it-
That's exactly the issue, is that we have associated a hard penis with desire. So for non-penis owners, how do we know when we don't have that as a cue? And for penis owners, what if you are actually feeling a lot of desire but don't have a hard penis? Like, all of that is part of the complication, of the complexity of this. And that's where how has patriarchy informed how we've thought about, viewed, and treated sex and sexuality issues when they've come into our office. Because we're all biased by that. So thank you so much for naming that. It's so beautiful. I know there was like tons of questions that were coming up today, and I hope that for those of you who are left thinking like, I've still got a question, that you'll join us for the course, because part of what's going to be included are 3 dedicated Q&A calls. Because I do expect that there'll be lots and lots and lots of questions, people having curiosity about themselves, curiosity about their cases, beliefs they've had. And I just want to invite that into this course. So thank you all for joining me today, and for sticking with me even after Terry concluded the call. And I hope to see as many of you as possible on March 11th. Take care.